On today's show, Rockets training camp day 2 and how injuries are already hurting Houston's season, plus why Tari's contract is being delayed and more. It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What is up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Fridays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets, where the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing, and then like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. On today's show, we're going to be getting updates from day 2 of Houston Rockets training camp and how injuries are already kind of setting this team back, unfortunately. A key reason why the Tari Eason contract is probably being delayed up to this point, and why the talks have dragged out as long as they have so far, as well as some other notes like Alperen Sengun potentially as a primary ball handler and more for this upcoming season. Of course, want to thank you so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gyms. Thank you so much for being an everydayer. Let's go ahead and hear really quickly a little bit of what Ime Udoka had to say from day 2 of Rockets training camp, and then we'll talk about it.
Dorian's not on the court. Do you expect him to be ready for the start of the season?
No, probably not.
Is he not clear for any basketball activities right now, or what's
No contact, but doing all the shooting and other things, but getting treatment as well during practice.
Do you have any sense for how many games he might miss?
I do not.
What have you liked about the way everybody's gelled together these first couple days?
Yeah, it's been good. I mean, we have a lot of corporate knowledge in the building after 2 years now, so the young guys get it, and then the people that we've added are, veterans as well. So it's not like my first year here where we had to kind of teach and build everything from the ground up. We'll reiterate the points, but they catch on quickly. So it's a good mix of veterans and young guys.
In these early days of camp, what are the main things you're trying to accomplish?
Well, gelling our team together with the new pieces, building on our identity, and so that's kind of been the message, is what worked well for us so far in these 2 years, and maintaining that, but then adding to it, and how the urgency and expectations and things of that nature, how fast we can get this group to come together. Obviously our guys are working hard in the offseason, so we're not really worried about conditioning or anything, but just the normal grind of getting back into it.
So that was a little bit of Ime Udoka from day 2 of Rockets training camp, and it really sucks that this Rockets team is already dealing with so many injuries so early on in the season. Obviously, no Fred VanVleet for the foreseeable future, and then now also learning, that Dorian Finney-Smith, having that offseason ankle surgery, isn't going to be ready to go for the start of the season. And there isn't even really a timetable yet on DFS. Like, that's the severity of it, is just, if it was like, oh yeah, he probably won't be ready until early November or whatever, then it's like, okay, he'll miss like the first, handful of games, but no timetable is a little alarming. And here's the thing, is the Rockets knew about the Dorian Finney-Smith surgery, and they knew probably that he wouldn't be available to start the season because of this rehabilitation process when they signed him, because he had the surgery all the way back in June. But the problem here is that they also didn't expect Fred VanVleet to suddenly get, have an ACL injury, right? So the Rockets now are looking pretty depleted, unfortunately. A team that was supposed to be able to really rely on their depth is suddenly missing some really key contributors, in particular, guys that they were really going to rely on for floor spacing and shooting between Fred VanVleet and Dorian Finney-Smith, to where you start to really get concerned about what this team is ultimately going to look like, what starting lineup and what lineups in totality are they going to be able to field to kind of start this season until they're able to get their hands on Dorian Finney-Smith. And once he's, healthy and back in the rotation, and obviously you're basically operating under the assumption that Fred's not going to play at all this season. And you start to think about what that's going to do to things like the floor spacing, and how that's going to negatively impact, the ability for guys like Kevin Durant and Alperen Sengun to have space to operate, for them to be able to create opportunities for their teammates. And even beyond that, what does that ultimately look like, right? Because now your bench depth is suddenly really suspect. Like, if we operate under the assumption that Reed just slides into the starting lineup, which I don't think is a given at this point, you've got Reed, Amen, Jabari, KD, and Sengun as your starting five. And then off your bench, you'll have Adams and Tari as your, like, the guys that were part of your key rotation guys last season. But you're going to be relying on pretty early out the gate. You're going to be relying on a lot of the stay ready crew guys to be able to step up and help fill some of that void in the rotation, right? You're going to see minutes for guys like you're going to see minutes for Aaron Holiday throughout the season regardless because of the Fred injury, but so Aaron's going to have a bigger role. You're probably going to see Jayshawn Tate minutes, on the wing as he's going to, be a bit of a stopgap until DFS is healthy. One other area that the Rockets might ultimately go is, they do still have the double big lineup that was so impactful, so effective for so much of, the end of last season and throughout the playoffs. And they did very intentionally go sign Clint Capela to be able to, run different versions of that double big lineup and to be able to run a version of that double big lineup even when Steven Adams is sitting out games or missing time. And you could very easily see a world where the Rockets just lean all the way into the double big lineup from the jump, right? Starting Steven Adams, moving Sengun to the 4, moving KD down to or moving Jabari down to the 3 and just running KD at the 2 and Amen at the 1, that Monstars lineup that we talked about, because then you could use on a nightly basis, at least to start until DFS is healthy. You can factor in Clint Capela. You can run the big lineups. You can, prioritize that zone defense and having all the length on the floor and just out-muscling, out-sizing your opponents on a nightly basis. That might be the easiest way for the Rockets to get to some of their win conditions and to be able to space out the rotation accordingly without having to rely too much on some of the other stay ready crew members. So it'll be really interesting to see how Ime Udoka kind of balances all of this, unfortunately. And it is unfortunate that the Rockets are now, losing two of the key contributors that they really thought they'd have to start the season. Granted, they have a relatively easy-ish start to the schedule, and they've got this abundance of talent on the roster that I think they'll be able to find ways to get through it. It just might not look pretty is the problem at the end of the day. Is like, between KD and Sengun and Amen, and the supporting cast around them, they have a ton of talent and the ability to probably overcome some of these, weaknesses or some of these, injuries, I should say. But that's also the other thing is, you don't want to wear down Kevin Durant this early in the season, this quickly, right? We've talked about it before, but, the idea that if the Rockets could get KD at, 32, 33, 34, 35 minutes a night, instead of really leaning on him for, 35, 36, 37, 38 minutes per game, you might be able to stretch it and get like 70 games out of KD instead of only like 60 games out of KD. And that's where things start to get really concerning is, if KD has to sit out or miss any time early whatsoever, suddenly you're missing two rotation guys, and then you factor in missing KD. Injuries might become a very real problem for this Rockets team this season, especially with Rockets beat reporter Daniel Lerner of the Houston Chronicle hinting that Steven Adams and Tari Eason might still not be playing on the second nights of back-to-backs, even as a preventative measure. Still a little bit concerning, and certainly something that might be having an effect on Tari Eason's contract negotiations. We're going to talk about that coming up here in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Peloton. Look, Peloton is shaping the future of fitness with their brand new Peloton Cross Training Tread Plus, powered by Peloton IQ. It's their most advanced equipment yet, designed to give you real-time guidance and endless ways to move, whether you're running, lifting, or cross-training with your favorite instructors. This is training reimagined. Peloton is built for breakthroughs with tools that help you plan, stay motivated, and reach peak performance. Peloton IQ system offers real-time strength coaching. It actually tracks your reps, suggests the right weights, and corrects your form, making every rep safer and smarter. It's a total game changer. You can go from running on the Tread Plus to strength training without missing a beat. So let yourself run, lift, flex, and push forward. Explore the new Peloton Cross Training Tread Plus today at onepeloton.com. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. So we did hear that Kevin Durant plans to sign his contract extension at Rockets Media Day. And so that was at least a little bit of a sigh of relief of, okay, all right, that's one down. It's not a guarantee, right? Until that pen hits the paper and Katie is officially inked and we have official reporting that contract extension has been signed, you still have to operate with a little bit of a grain of salt. Like, will it happen? Is he going to wait to see if things go sideways this season? Whatever. But at least, he has a verbal commitment in the public eye that is his intent. Meanwhile, unfortunately, the final kind of, contract situation for the Rockets, a situation that hopefully gets remedied, before the start of the season, because the final day for the rookie scale contract extensions is October 20th. And as we're fast approaching, it feels like we might start to see a small kind of like avalanche, tidal wave, what have you, of rookie scale deals start to come flowing in for this season. Nikola Jovic just got his rookie scale contract extension for $62.4 million, something from the Miami Heat. So he's now the fifth player of that 2022 draft class to receive an extension, Jabari Smith Jr. being one of them as well. J-Dub, Paolo Banchero, Chet Holmgren being the other three. So the Tari contract situation is so delicate, and we might have gotten a little bit of a glimmer as to one of the possible reasons. And here's the end of the day here is, if Tari still isn't 100% healthy, moving forward with the issues that he's been dealing with, the leg issues, the weird leg injury that he had a couple years ago, the one that kept him out of back-to-backs and still, with a bit of a minutes restriction at points last season, right? If this is going to be a consistent lingering issue for him throughout his career, which at least, and we're really, maybe looking a little too hard at this or looking super into this, but Daniel Lerner of the Houston Chronicle did suggest that the Rockets could still look to rest Tari Eason and Steven Adams on back-to-backs this season. And she made the point to, reemphasize that it was, as a preventative measure more than anything. But even still, Tari is, 22 years old. He's young. There really shouldn't be a reason when, being this far removed from that type of injury, that Tari shouldn't be back to a place where he's, 100%. He said during media day that his leg is good, that he feels good relative to where he was this time last year. But, how much of that is just, media day fluff, like, yeah, everything's great, I'm healthy 100%, versus behind the scenes, if the medical staff does have legitimate concerns, or if they are being very precautionary about things with Tari, that could absolutely be playing a factor in his contract negotiations with Rafael Stone and the Rockets front office. Because at the end of the day, if Tari feels that he's 100%, but if the medical staff is looking at things and they're saying, we're still seeing some concerns, or there's some issues here, or anything of that nature, anything that even, because again, why would you be preventative in nature if there wasn't at least the small risk for re-aggravating that injury, or if there was some existing pain or something going on there, unfortunately. And that's kind of the dilemma here, is if Tari isn't 100%, then I could absolutely see that being a very big sticking point in these contract negotiations. Now, it could just be as simple as Tari feels that he is, a starting caliber player, that he feels he's worth a certain amount of money, and the Rockets have, their kind of financial roadmap of, how they've planned things out for years down the line. They've got to deal with a Kevin Durant extension. They've already got LP locked down, but he's one of their top money makers. They're going to have to deal with giving Amen likely a rookie scale max this upcoming offseason. So because of all these other financial factors to be able to consider down the line, the Rockets can't just go and throw the bag at Tari Eason, right? Especially if they don't envision a bigger role for him down the line. And that's the problem, is if they don't envision Tari eventually becoming a starting caliber player, or at the very least being like their most important player coming off the bench, right? Like their sixth man, their supercharged sub off the bench, occasional closer, that type of player. If they don't view him in that light, if he's still in their eyes more of the seventh or eighth or ninth man off the bench, which frankly he shouldn't be. Like Tari is so incredibly talented and has shown so much in his time on the floor. Granted, he missed, such a big chunk of his career with that injury in year 2, but in the time that he has had, like, he's been so incredibly impactful, and he continues to grow and evolve his game. We saw him take some steps forward last season offensively as a ball handler, as a driver, as somebody who could get to some different spots on the floor. Some of those turnaround mid-range shots and things that, weren't really in his bag previously. And he continues to grow as a defender. He's the second best point of attack defender on the team. Like, there's a lot to love about Tari Eason, the player. But then you start to look at, okay, well, if your starting lineup for the foreseeable future is going to be Ime, Sengun, KD until he hangs it up, and Jabari, and assuming that the Rockets don't suddenly decide to jump ship with Fred VanVleet and trade him for some other piece or whatever, like, I mean, that's your starting lineup, right? Is you just don't have room in the starting lineup for Tari Eason. And you just committed, something, a little north of $20 million a year to Jabari Smith Jr. on his extension. And Tari probably feels that he's worth something in that same ballpark, right? Is that, just over 20 million a year, somewhere in that range, 5 years, 120 some odd million. But at the end of the day, you have to also try and match those extensions with whatever the available role is. And that was the other point that Tari brought up at Media Day when I had the chance to ask him about his role on this team. And he does want a bigger role, right? And at least as far as I know, right, there isn't any bad blood. This is not like a Cam Whitmore situation. He's not like disgruntled. Tari is very gruntled. He's good. But at the same time, if he feels like he wants to bet on himself and vie for, a bigger contract down the line, or more minutes elsewhere, or a bigger role elsewhere, then, I could see a situation if Tari doesn't want to, commit to Houston long-term on a cheaper deal, right? If the Rockets are trying to get him somewhere in that 15, 16, 17 million dollars a year kind of role, if he's thinking he's worth north of 20 or closer to 25 per season, given his impact when he's on the floor, then that's why it probably feels like they're at a little bit of a stalemate, right? And hopefully that situation can get resolved. Hopefully it's a situation where both sides can finally settle in on a number before the season starts that both sides can feel good about. Maybe you start to push the envelope a little higher around like that 18, 19 per year number. And that's where things can hopefully maybe settle in and feel like something like, I don't know, 4 years, $76 million, $78 million, something like that for a rookie scale extension for Tari. Even that starts to feel really expensive. Paying a bench player almost $20 million a year starts to feel really kind of, but you also have to remember that the NBA salary cap is going to continue to climb. Some of these deals that the Rockets are signing now or have signed over the last 1 or 2 years are going to start to look really, really, really good. Like Alperen Sengun's deal already looks incredible. The way that Rafael Stone was able to, save some money on his contract and get him on a bit of a team-friendly contract for his rookie scale extension. So it could just be Rafael Stone playing hardball again at the end of the day and trying to get the best bang for his buck, the best possible value, given some of the financial restrictions and limitations that are going to be that are already placed on this team by being right up against the first apron. But it certainly feels like if Tari isn't 100%, that's also another one of those issues to monitor as far as the Rockets' overall health this season. Because if you suddenly don't have Tari and Adams on back-to-backs, and you're already missing DFS, and you don't have Fred VanVleet, like we're talking the Rockets being down like 4 or 5 different rotation players at various points, especially when you start to factor in that KD will at some point miss some time this season. Hopefully not, but it's probably going to happen. Things could look really rough at various points. I want your thoughts on the Tari Eason contract. What do you think Tari is worth contractually? What contract would you like to see the Rockets come up with for Tari Eason? Give me your thoughts in the YouTube comments. Coming up, final thoughts from day 2 of Houston Rockets training camp. Alperen Sengun operating as a primary ball handler, possibly, and more. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NFL season is here, and FanDuel has an offer you don't want to miss out on. Right now, new customers can bet just $5, $5 only, and get $300 in bonus bets if you win. That's right. You pick a bet, put down the $5, and if it hits, you'll unlock $300 in bonus bets to use all across the app. FanDuel's great because it lets you bet in so many different ways. You can build out your parlays. You can try different player props. You can even follow the live lines during the game. Look, if you're not into all of that, though, you can just keep it super simple over at FanDuel, and you can take a look at the outright betting favorites for the Super Bowl this season. Right now, the Bills plus 430, the Eagles plus 600, the Lions and Packers at both plus 9. I apologize, Lions, Packers, and Chiefs all at plus 900, and then bringing up the rear is the Ravens at plus 1,000. So for all those odds and so much more, go check them out at FanDuel.com to download the FanDuel app today and get started. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, so unlike previous years with training camp, where we have been able to get more of a glimpse behind the curtain, see some scrimmaging, things of that nature, we haven't really gotten much this year, unfortunately. Through 2 days, it's been really dry. It's just been like free throw drills, and so no really great peek behind the curtain so far, outside of just the clips that the Rockets social media team has been allowed to post from before the actual media is able to get into the practice to interview the players and Ime and whatnot. But from some of the clips that we have seen, it does seem like Alperen Sengun is handling the basketball a considerable amount, and is, doing things, operating and doing things like, bringing the ball up and then, getting little brush screens or traffic screens to be able to then go around, some inverted pick and roll actions, little things like that. Some of the similar things that we saw him doing during Eurobasket with Turkey, basically just, walking the ball up and having, another, whether it's the 3 or the 4 or the point guard or, just some of these inverted pick and roll actions. And when you start to think about how the Rockets are going to achieve some of their success this season offensively, especially in light of the Fred VanVleet injury, as well as missing, another key contributor in Dorian Finney-Smith, at least to start the season, things might look rough, like I mentioned earlier in segment 1, just as far as, spacing and shooting and, things might look a little, bumpy at times. But this is where you're going to really need to see Ime Udoka get creative with some of the different ways that he can utilize some of the talents on this roster. Again, maybe it's just leaning all the way into the size and the double big lineups, and we might see like a big man rotation of Alp at the 4, Adams at the 5, Capela also being sprinkled in there at times. And then that's the way to kind of flesh out the rest of the rotation, because you lean into that big man rotation at the 4-5 spot. And then that gives you, KD and Jabari and Tari as your wings moving forward. And then that gives you, for your guard rotation, Amon Thompson and Reed Shepherd and Aaron Holiday to a lesser degree, right? Or maybe Ime keeps things a little bit more traditional, right? And he leans into Jayshawn Tate, right? And maybe a little bit of Jeff Green at times if he doesn't want to go all the way with the double big lineups and playing that jumbo supersized Monstars-esque version of basketball. But I think that, whatever way you slice it for this Rockets team, if they do go the super jumbo big lineup, spacing is going to be an issue, because if you have Amen, Sengun, and Adams out there all at the same time, that's 3 non-shooters on the floor. And that puts a ton of pressure on the other 2 guys, being Jabari Smith Jr. and Kevin Durant, more than likely to be able to be high-level floor spacers to keep things unlocked for the rest of the offense, which is why it feels like, just from a spacing perspective, and because you want KD and Sengun to have enough room to operate, it kind of feels like Reed Shepherd is just going to be the de facto pick to be thrown into the starting lineup because he's the closest. He's the guy who can most closely emulate some of the things that Fred VanVleet brings to the table. Most importantly, being that floor spacing, that shooting ability. And here's the thing: is just because you throw Reed in the starting lineup doesn't mean that he has to suddenly have like the usage or the on-ball amount of time that Fred VanVleet would have had. You don't have to play it that way. You can still bring Reed along slowly. You can still have him in a much smaller role offensively and let him kind of work himself into a bigger role, even if he's in the starting lineup. But to do that, it's going to necessitate playing through Kevin Durant and Alperen Sengun and Ime Thompson. And again, you do not, and this is my one really big concern with how things are shaping up to start this Rocket season, is you do not want to wear out KD early, right? Like you can't just put KD in bubble wrap, unfortunately, until the playoffs, because he is a very important, integral part of this Rockets team, and you're going to need KD. You know, you're going to need his scoring. You're going to need his gravity. You're going to need him for so many different things throughout the season that, you know, unfortunately, with how this roster is kind of shaping up, you know, if Fred was healthy and if DFS was healthy, I'd feel a lot more confident about what this team is going to look like in games that KD might miss. But as it stands right now, like if KD misses time, I don't know where the Rockets are going to get their additional scoring from. Like, you know, it's going to be really tough at times for this team this season. It's not going to be nearly as clean as things probably looked last year. And that's where I come away thinking that it's going to be so important for Ime to really lean into the playmaking and creation ability of Alperen Sengun and Ime Thompson. And there's two very different ways to do that, right? Because they're two very different players stylistically. For Alperen Sengun, right, it's going to mean putting the ball in his hands and letting him really dictate the flow of the offense, right? Running the offense through Alperen Sengun, very similar to what we saw him doing during Eurobasket, right? Put the ball in his hands, let him run the show, and good things will ultimately happen, right? He will command double teams, or he will score the ball himself, whether it's him facing up and driving and attacking the defense that way, or getting to his back to the basket game down low and commanding a double team, you know, bringing over that weak side defender, and being able to flip it out, you know, to the shooters, you know, on the wings, be it Jabari or KD or Reed, you know, things like that. You know, that's Alp's style of creating on offense. And then again, you can get creative with other little things like some inverted pick and roll actions and different little 2-man game sets that you can run, some empty corner actions between him and KD, or some DHO stuff between Alp and Reed Shepherd. Like there's a lot of different things that can be done with this team. And that's where you need to see some creativity and experimentation from Ime Udoka, because without the steady, tried and true guiding hand of Fred VanVleet, you probably can't just get away with like spamming pick and roll every possession down and like, okay, hey, Fred's going to walk it up and Alp's going to set a screen, and then we're going to do a pick and roll and get Alp on the short roll and like see what's up here and, you know, let the defense react. Like you can do that a little bit, but it's going to be a lot easier to key in on that, especially depending on who the primary ball handler is. Like if the primary is going to be Ime doesn't have the shooting gravity that Fred does, right? That teams are just going to slide under the pick and you know, Amen's quick enough that he might still be able to get by them and get to the basket, but it certainly presents its own little, you know, set of headaches as to how things are going to be defended. And then Reed Shepherd, you know, at least from what we've seen so far of him, hasn't really handled ball pressure very great up to this point in his career. Hopefully he's ready to take significant strides forward in that regard, but I'm not going to suddenly expect Reed Shepherd to be on the same level as a pick and roll creator as Fred VanVleet was. So you're not going to be able to rely on that action as much. And again, you don't want to spam KD as a primary ball handler too much too early in the season, because that's the thing you don't want to have to rely on considerably. You want to be able to, again, preserve KD a little bit. So that's where you start coming away. You need some creative sets for Sengun with the ball in his hands. And you also need some creative stuff for Ime Thompson. And when I think about creative things for Ime Thompson, you know, I think the Rockets are certainly going to have to find some stretches during a game where they go small. And that's where I think things get really interesting is, first off, I don't even know if they have necessarily really the 5-man personnel to be able to do this without Dorian Finney-Smith. But we've talked about it before. When you put Ime Thompson out there, there's going to be times where we see these, like, we'll call them quote unquote small ball lineups where you have Amin and Jabari and KD and Tari, and then one more guy out there, whether it's Reed or Aaron Holiday or what have you, but kind of this small five switch everything lineup. Later on, it'll be DFS included in some of these lineups, where you basically do a 5-out lineup where you put the ball in Amin Thompson's hands and just let him terrorize and get downhill. And it might, the Rockets can't run that style essentially from the jump of the game because Alperen Sengun isn't a consistent floor spacer yet. But, the Rockets are going to kind of vacillate probably in a given game between being that jumbo Monstars-esque lineup that really leans into the size, the physicality, the length, as well as, when you have Adams out there, he provides his own, even though he's not a shooter, he provides his own level of gravity, like we saw in the playoffs where, he plants in a spot near the paint and the other big can't leave him. Otherwise, it's a guaranteed offensive rebound. So that level of gravity is helpful in and of itself. And it also forces, the secondary big for the other team to be the one to guard Sengun. And that's a matchup advantage for Alp. So you have different ways to create advantages with some of these lineups. And the 5-out lineup, the small ball lineup, we just call it the Amin lineup, right? Just where you put the ball in Amin's hands and you give him 5-out spacing and really let him go to town and get downhill. With maybe you get the initial screen from Jabari or KD or what have you, but somebody who can basically pick and pop in those actions, as well as having the other 3 guys spaced out in the on the wings and in the corners. That's going to be some offense that I think the Rockets really need to get into and really need to prioritize, but it's going to be tough to find ways to balance and get the most out of both sides, because you want, like 10 to 15 minutes a game of the double big lineup between Adams and Sengun. So then, how do you then balance and then get to we'll call it the Amin lineup for another 10 to 15 minutes out of the game, right? And then how much time are the starters ultimately going to play together? And how do you balance all these lineups and different rotations? And during which points do you lean on? Do you go for the more traditional look from the start of the game and then pivot to the big lineup later? Do you start with the big lineup and then pivot to the traditional lineup and then eventually break out the small ball lineup with Amin against like second units? Like, what is going to be the most effective route for this Rockets team this season? And there's so many question marks, and hopefully we'll start to get some semblance of answers to these throughout training camp. Again, it's been a little dry through 2 days so far, unfortunately. But we'll get our first glimpse at what the Rockets truly look like on the floor next Monday when they play the Atlanta Hawks. So we're only a few days removed from being able to watch Houston Rockets basketball again. And that game will be incredibly telling as to what Ime Udoka is thinking as far as his lineups, as far as his rotations, and kind of what we can potentially envision the Rockets doing to actually start the NBA season, not just all this speculative stuff about lineups and whatnot. So I definitely want your thoughts in the YouTube comments. Give me your thoughts on everything we discussed here in today's episode. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.